They thought I'd vanish without a fight. After 29 years of loyalty, I was fired just 3 days before my pension fully vested. A half-hearted handshake, a severance envelope, and a security guard waiting to escort me out the door. I'd walked through thousands of times, but they didn't know me. They didn't know I'd spent a lifetime documenting every detail, every mistake, every lie. In my coat pocket, my late wife's old business card still sat, a reminder of the promise I'd kept: always do what's right, no matter the cost. My name is Michael Harper, 61 years old, a veteran, and the Director of Compliance at GRW Manufacturing in St. Paul, Minnesota. My job was to keep every financial report clean, every operation in line with federal regulations. I built my career on integrity, one number, one report at a time. But on a rainy Friday afternoon, the new director, Stephen Caldwell, sat behind his mahogany desk, looked at me with cold eyes, and said, "We don't need you anymore." It wasn't a business decision, it was a calculated stab in the back, time to steal what I'd earned through sweat and tears. I didn't yell. I didn't beg. I just took the envelope, nodded, and walked away. But in my mind, a plan was already forming. They thought they'd won. They were wrong. And I was going to make them pay. Not with anger, but with the truth. I walked into Stephen Caldwell's office at 4 p.m. as the light faded through the Venetian blinds in GRW Manufacturing's main building in downtown St. Paul. The air was thick, the burnt coffee smell from the break room's machine mingling with the hum of the air conditioner. In my 29 years here, I'd never been summoned to a director's office on a Friday. That was never a good sign. I sat in the leather chair across from Stephen's desk, my eyes catching the manila envelope sitting prominently in front of him. My name was written on it in black ink: Michael Harper. "How long have you been with us, Michael?" Stephen asked, his tone so casual it felt rehearsed. He leaned back in his chair, hands clasped, his polished shoes glinting under the fluorescent lights. 29 years and 362 days, I replied, my voice steady. In my head, I was counting down 3 days until my pension fully vested, the reward for nearly 3 decades of service. I started at GRW in 1996, when it was just a small factory along the Mississippi River. Now it's one of Minnesota's largest manufacturers, and I, as Director of Compliance, had kept their operations legal, every financial report, every federal regulation, while others pushed for shortcuts. Stephen smiled, but his eyes stayed on the envelope. "That's quite a run. Impressive." He paused, then slid the envelope toward me. "But due to budget constraints, we're letting you go, effective immediately." Time seemed to slow. I heard the wall clock ticking, the faint sound of traffic from Grand Avenue outside. Budget constraints. GRW had just announced record profits last quarter, $12 million, a figure I'd scrutinized as Director of Compliance. This wasn't about money. This was something else, timed with precision to hit right before I could claim my pension, worth over $800,000. I looked at Stephen. At 42, he'd joined the company 6 months ago with a reputation as a cost cutter. His face was clean-shaven, his gray suit tailored to perfection, his eyes as cold as the Minnesota River in January. He expected me to crumble, to plead, or at least to lash out. But I'd learned long ago, working at my father's hardware store in East St. Paul, that emotions don't solve problems. The truth does. "Thank you for the opportunity," I said, my voice calm. I picked up the envelope but didn't open it. "This is your severance package," Stephen continued, tapping the desk with his finger. "Sign by tomorrow, or you get nothing. Lisa from HR will escort you to clear out your desk." I stood, adjusted my coat, and felt the weight of Margaret's old business card in my pocket. It was the only thing she left me before she passed 12 years ago, a card from her first job at the city library. With her handwritten note, "Always do what's right, Michael." I nodded at Stephen, said nothing more, and walked out. Lisa Bennett, an HR rep with apologetic eyes, was waiting in the hallway. "I'm so sorry, Michael," she whispered, glancing at the security guard near the elevator. I gave her a small smile. "It's all right, Lisa. Just business." But inside, I knew better. This wasn't business. This was betrayal, calculated to steal what I'd earned with sweat and tears. We walked through the cubicles, where my colleagues bowed their heads, pretending to focus on their screens. I heard whispers, the pause of keyboards as I passed. 29 years, and now I was a ghost in the place I'd called home. I packed my desk, a photo of Margaret and me at our wedding in St. Paul's Cathedral, a potted plant James gave me when he left for college 15 years ago, and a bronze plaque for 25 years of service. I didn't take much, The things that mattered most couldn't fit in a cardboard box. Lisa stood nearby, hands clasped, visibly uncomfortable. "This isn't right," she said softly, just out of the guard's earshot. "I know," I replied, placing the plaque in the box. "But it's not over yet." She looked at me, her eyes a mix of curiosity and worry. But I didn't elaborate. The guard, a young guy named Tom I'd once talked baseball with, held the main door open. "Have a good weekend, Mr. Harper," he said, his voice awkward. I nodded. "I think I will, Tom." As I stepped outside, the April rain misted onto my coat, and a strange clarity settled over me. Stephen thought he'd taken me out of the game, but he didn't know I'd been playing it far longer than he had, and I had an ace he'd never see coming. I drove through St. Paul's familiar streets, past the cathedral, where Margaret and I vowed our lives, past the school where James performed in the choir. The rain tapped my windshield, matching the rhythm of my thoughts. For 29 years, I'd sacrificed for GRW, late nights, checking numbers, family vacations cut short by compliance emergencies. Times I stood up to report discrepancies, only to be brushed off. I'd believed my honesty would be rewarded, that the company would honor my loyalty. But today, they'd shown me their true color. At my modest home in the Highland neighborhood, I sat in the living room, the dim glow of a table lamp illuminating the manila envelope. I opened it, scanning the terms: 3 months' salary, no pension, no health insurance, and a clause waiving all rights to sue. They wanted my signature by 5 p.m. tomorrow, banking on fear and desperation to silence me. But they'd underestimated me. I stood and walked to my small basement office, where I kept personal records. Behind a row of family photo albums was a fireproof lockbox, securely fastened. Inside were hundreds of pages I'd collected over 4 years. Falsified financial reports, emails directing cover-ups, notes from meetings where I was told to overlook mismatched numbers. I'd kept them not for revenge, but because my professional instinct, what my father called a shopkeeper's eye, always knew when something was off. I pulled Margaret's business card from my pocket and set it beside the box. "Always do what's right," I murmured, as if she were there. Then I picked up the phone and dialed Robert Nguyen, GRW's former CFO, now with the Securities and Exchange Commission. It was time for the truth to speak. Sitting in my living room, the dim glow of the table lamp casting shadows on the cardboard box holding relics from my office desk, I felt memories flood back like the Mississippi River flowing through St. Paul. The April rain still tapped steadily against the window, but my mind drifted to the early days, when I was a young man standing behind the counter at my father's hardware store in East St. Paul. That's where I learned that honesty wasn't just a choice, it was the foundation of everything worth having. I grew up in a modest house on Payne Avenue, less than 2 miles from the Mississippi River. My father, a stoic man with calloused hands from years of labor, ran Harper's Hardware with a simple rule: customers trust us because we never lie. Every afternoon after school, I stood by his side, logging orders, checking inventory, and learning to read people through their eyes. "Michael," he'd say, "numbers don't lie, even when people do." That lesson stuck with me, etched as deeply as the words on Margaret's business card I still carried. In 1985, after high school, I enlisted, serving 2 years in the Navy at the base in Norfolk, Virginia. They weren't glamorous years, but they taught me discipline and duty. When I returned to St. Paul, I met Margaret at a community dance at St. Paul's Cathedral. She was a librarian, with a gentle smile and sharp eyes. "You're a man of numbers, Michael," she'd tease when I double-checked a restaurant bill. But she was the one who urged me to pursue a career that demanded integrity. In 1996, I joined GRW Manufacturing, a metal components factory along the Mississippi River. Back then, the company had just 200 employees, and the office was a cluster of small rooms with linoleum floors and bulletin boards plastered with handwritten notes. I started as a junior accountant, working in a corner cubicle with an old IBM computer, but I quickly showed a knack for spotting small discrepancies: an invoice that didn't add up, a shipment missing paperwork. By 2002, I moved to the compliance department, and by 2010, I was director of compliance, responsible for ensuring GRW's operations, from financial reports to quality checks, stayed within the law. Those early years at GRW were filled with camaraderie. I remember all-hands meetings in the conference room, where the old CEO, Harold Grayson, stood before a whiteboard, sketching plans to expand the plant. "We're a family," he'd say, and I believed it. I worked late, sometimes until 10 p.m., to verify numbers for quarterly reports. Margaret never complained, even when it meant missing James's piano recitals or weekend evenings by Lake Como. "You're building our future," she'd say, resting her hand on my shoulder. But I knew she sacrificed more than she let on. In 2008, Margaret was diagnosed with cancer. She passed away in the winter of 2013, leaving me and James, then just 18, in a house that suddenly felt too quiet. Her business card, the one from her first job at the city library, with her handwritten note, "Always do what's right," Michael became my talisman. I carried it everywhere. A reminder of our promise. It was in my coat pocket, even on the day I was fired. After Margaret's death, I poured myself into work. Giardolo had grown into a giant, with over 2,000 employees and contracts worth millions of dollars. But with growth came cracks. In 2015, I noticed a shipment of components misreported in the financials, a mistake that inflated paper profits by $200,000. I wrote a memo to the CFO at the time, but got only a curt email. "Thanks, Michael, we'll handle it." Nothing was handled. Similar discrepancies kept appearing, growing bolder. Forged invoices, altered quality control reports, emails instructing staff to adjust numbers before audits. As Director of Compliance, I reported each issue through proper channels, as my job demanded. I presented evidence in meetings, pointing out mismatched figures, but was often dismissed with lines like, "Don't make a mountain out of a molehill, Michael," or "We've got bigger fish to fry." Once at a 2018 all-hands meeting, I stood up to question a company loan with unclear data. The CEO at the time gave me a hard, "Just focus on your job, Harper." I sat down, feeling the eyes of colleagues, some sympathetic, some annoyed. But I didn't stop. My father taught me that the truth always finds a way, and Margaret reminded me that integrity was never up for trade. In the years that followed, I started keeping copies of questionable documents, not because I planned to use them, but because I knew they'd matter someday. I stored them in a fireproof lockbox at home, alongside my Navy veteran's pin and family photos. Each time I opened the box, I saw Margaret's business card, and it grounded me in why I kept doing this job, even as the company began to change. When Stephen Caldwell arrived in 2024, with promises of modernization and cost-cutting, I knew tougher days were coming. But I never imagined he'd move so fast, or so ruthlessly. Tonight, sitting in my living room, I looked at the cardboard box from Giardolo's office. Inside was the bronze plaque, "For 25 years of service," an object that once filled me with pride. Now it was just a reminder of their betrayal. But it also reminded me of what I'd learned from my father, from Margaret, from my Navy days. Patience and truth always prevail. Stephen Caldwell thought he'd taken me out of the game, but he didn't know I'd spent a lifetime preparing for this moment. And I wasn't about to let 29 years of dedication be erased without consequences. I stood, pulled Margaret's business card from my coat pocket, and set it on the table. The lamp's light caught her handwritten word. Like a whisper from the past, "Always do what's right," I murmured. And I knew that no matter how hard the road ahead, I'd follow that promise, not for revenge, but for integrity. The one thing Giardolo had tried to take from me. I stood in my small basement office, the glow from an old desk lamp illuminating the fireproof lockbox on the oak table. Outside, the April rain pattered steadily, but in this room, time seemed to stand still. Margaret's business card, with its handwritten note, "Always do what's right," rested beside the box, a silent companion. I turned the key, and hundreds of pages of documents came into view, evidence of Giardo Manufacturing's wrongdoing, meticulously collected over 4 years. This wasn't the time for anger. This was the time to act, and I knew the truth would be my strongest weapon. After leaving Stephen Caldwell's office yesterday afternoon, I'd driven home through the rain, my mind churning with what had happened. The severance envelope still sat unopened on the living room table, a silent challenge. I knew signing it would cost me everything, not just my pension, but my integrity. But I didn't rush. My father once told me, "A good shopkeeper never acts on emotion," and Margaret, with her gentle smile, always reminded me that patience was power. I wouldn't confront Stephen head-on. I'd let the numbers tell their own story. I started with the lockbox. Inside were over 1,200 pages, manipulated financial reports, emails from executives directing adjustments to figures, notes from meetings where I was told to ignore discrepancies. Each page was a piece of a larger picture of systematic fraud at Giardo, a picture I'd seen forming for years, but had been forced to keep quiet. I spread the documents across the table, organizing them chronologically, the way I used to sort orders at my father's hardware store. This work required precision, and I'd learned in the Navy that a single misstep could sink the whole operation. When the clock struck 10 p.m., my phone buzzed. A text from Lisa Bennett in HR. "Michael, please call back. We need to discuss the severance agreement." I stared at the screen, a cold surge of adrenaline running through me. They were nervous. If this was truly just a budget issue, as Stephen claimed, why the urgency? I didn't respond. Instead, I kept working, sorting emails into folders, falsified reports, directed misconduct, quality control. Each document was a bullet, and I was assembling an arsenal no one could refute. By midnight, I paused to brew a cup of coffee, its bitter taste reminding me of early mornings at GR Dewitt, when colleagues and I gathered around the break room's coffee machine. Those days were gone, but the memory of my loyalty to the company lingered. I'd sacrificed too much nights, with James, vacations with Margaret, to keep GR on the right path. And now they wanted me gone, because I refused to look the other way. I gripped the mug tightly, then set it down. Anger wouldn't help. The truth would. I returned to the desk and picked up my phone, dialing Robert Nguyen. Robert had been GR CFO before moving to the Securities and Exchange Commission, SEC, 3 years ago. He'd always respected my thoroughness, even when others found it tedious. The phone rang 3 times before he answered. "Michael?" His voice came through, surprised but warm. "It's late. Everything okay?" "Not exactly," I said, my tone even. "I was fired today, 3 days before my pension vests." There was a pause on the other end. Then Robert asked, his voice lower, "Who's behind this?" I told him everything: the meeting with Stephen, the severance envelope, and the documents in the lockbox. "I have evidence, Robert, thousands of pages, financial fraud, falsified reports, all systematic. And I think they fired me to shut me up." Robert was silent for a moment, then said, "Don't sign anything, Michael. Send me a list of what you've got. If this is what you're describing, GR is sitting on a powder keg." He asked me to meet him and his SEC team on Monday, and warned, "Keep those documents somewhere safe. And don't talk to anyone, not even colleagues." I agreed, feeling as if a weight had lifted from my chest. For the first time that day, I felt in control. After the call, I worked until 3 a.m., making 3 copies of every document, one for the SEC, one for my personal records, and one as a backup. I labeled each folder, created a detailed index, and double-checked every page to ensure nothing was missed. The process was like those long nights auditing numbers at GR Dewitt, but this time I wasn't doing it for the company. I was doing it for myself, for Margaret, for the promise I'd kept for 29 years. As dawn approached, my phone buzzed again. A text from an unknown number. "Mr. Harper, this is your last chance to sign the agreement. Think carefully." I stared at the message, my lips pressing into a thin line. They were desperate, and that only confirmed I was on the right path. I set the phone down, picked up Margaret's business card from the table, and traced her handwritten words. "They think I'll disappear," I murmured, "but I'm still here." I stored the document copies in a safe, in my bedroom, locking it tightly, and took the originals to the bank the next morning. At the Highland neighborhood branch, I met Karen Walsh, the bank manager I'd known from handling GR transactions. "Michael, you look stressed," she said, half joking. "Just a long day," I replied, handing her the box of documents. "Keep this in a safe deposit box for me." Karen nodded, asking no questions, but her eyes suggested she sensed something was wrong. Back home, I sat down and drafted a summary for Robert, listing the key documents: 47 manipulated financial reports, 16 emails directing misconduct, and 9 memos I'd sent to leadership that were ignored. I emailed it to him with a note: "I'm ready to do whatever it takes." When I hit send, a clarity I hadn't felt in years washed over me. This wasn't revenge. This was justice, and I'd deliver it my way, quietly, intelligently, undeniably. By Saturday noon, my phone kept buzzing. Lisa called again, her voice trembling. "Michael, Stephen's pressuring me to reach you. He says you need to sign by tonight." I let the call go to voicemail. An hour later, an email from GR legal office arrived. "Dear Mr. Harper, failure to sign the agreement may lead to serious consequences." I gave a faint smile. They didn't know that serious consequences had already begun, and I wouldn't be the one facing them. I stood and walked to the back porch, looking out at the small garden Margaret used to tend. The rain had stopped, and the air carried the damp earth smell of St. Paul. I thought of James, what he'd say if he knew about this. I wanted to call him but held back. This was my fight, and I'd wage it in a way Margaret would be proud of. Not with shouts, but with truth. Her business card still sat on the table, and I knew that, no matter what Giardua did, they couldn't take the one thing that mattered most: my integrity. The rain in St. Paul had stopped, but the air in my Highland neighborhood home still felt heavy, as if another storm was brewing. I sat in the living room, the soft yellow glow of the table lamp illuminating Margaret's business card, its handwritten note, "Always do what's right," a quiet reminder of the path ahead. My phone on the table buzzed relentlessly. The third call from Lisa Bennett today. I didn't pick up. I'd already emailed Robert Nguyen, secured the documents in a safe deposit box, and steeled myself for the SEC meeting on Monday. Giardua wanted me to sign the severance agreement to stay silent, but I wasn't the kind of man to be broken. They'd picked the wrong fight. By Saturday afternoon, the pressure from Giardua was unmistakable. Lisa left a voicemail, her voice trembling through the speaker. "Michael Stevens says if you don't sign by 5 p.m., the company will take legal action. Please call me back." I listened to the message, my lips pressing into a tight line. Legal action. They were trying to scare me, but the desperation in Lisa's voice only confirmed what I already knew. They knew I had something dangerous. I deleted the voicemail and checked my email. A new message from Edward Thornton, Giardua's board chairman, sat in my inbox, titled "Final Opportunity to Resolve." I opened it, reading the carefully crafted lines. "Dear Mr. Harper, we urge you to seriously consider the severance agreement. Failure to cooperate may lead to adverse consequences." The threat was cloaked in polite language, but I saw through it. Edward, who'd barely acknowledged me in 29 years, was now trying to back me into a corner. I closed the laptop, a faint smile crossing my face. They didn't know I held a cache of documents that could make the entire board tremble. As dusk settled over Highland, the doorbell rang. I peered through the peephole, and my pulse quickened. Stephen Caldwell stood there, his gray suit out of place in my middle-class neighborhood. He knocked, his voice carrying through the wooden door. "Michael, I know you're in there." He opened the door. "We can sort this out." I stood still, watching through the peephole. Stephen glanced around, visibly uneasy, then slipped an envelope into my mailbox. "Sign it, Michael. Don't make this harder than it needs to be," he called one last time before heading back to his sleek luxury sedan parked on the street. I waited until his car disappeared, before retrieving the envelope. Another copy of the severance agreement, with a handwritten note. "Last chance. 9 a.m. Monday." I placed the envelope on the table beside Margaret's business card. A cold clarity settling over me. Stephen hadn't come to negotiate. He'd come to intimidate, but he didn't know I was already steps ahead. The documents locked in the bank's safe deposit box were undeniable proof, and the SEC meeting would open a door Giardua couldn't close. I didn't need to shout or confront him. The truth was enough, and it was waiting for its moment. My phone buzzed again, this time with a call from James, my son. I answered, knowing he'd pick up on something off in my voice. "Dad, what's going on?" he asked immediately, his tone worried. He was in Denver, working as an engineer for a startup, but we still talked every week. I considered shielding him from the truth, but James deserved to know. "I was fired yesterday," I said, my voice steady. 3 days before my pension vests." "What?" James nearly shouted. "They can't do that. You've given your life to that place." I smiled faintly, hearing his outrage. "They did, but don't worry, I'm handling it." James went quiet for a moment, then asked, "Do you need me to come home? I can be in St. Paul tomorrow." I shook my head, though he couldn't see. "No need, James. I've got this. Just stay there and do your job well." "But what are you going to do?" he pressed, his voice softer as if sensing I was holding something back. I glanced at Margaret's business card on the table, a wave of certainty rising in me. "I'm going to let the truth speak," I said, "like your mom always told me to do." James gave a small laugh, a sound that echoed the days when our family was whole. "Mom would be proud of you," he said, "but if you need me, just call." I nodded, even if only to myself. "I know, son." After the call, I stepped onto the back porch, looking out at the small garden Margaret used to tend. Her rose bushes still bloomed, though not as vibrant as they once were. I thought of the years we'd built this life together, of her promise that integrity would always guide the way. Stephen and Giardua thought they could break me, but they didn't understand that I'd faced bigger challenges. Losing Margaret, raising James alone, those long nights in the Navy, when everything felt hopeless. Compared to those, their pressure was just a passing breeze. I returned inside, and checked my email one last time. A new message from the legal office, sharper in tone. Dear Mr. Harper, we strongly advise immediate action to avoid undesirable consequences. I deleted it without hesitation. They could send as many emails, make as many calls, or even stand at my doorstep. It didn't matter. I'd chosen my path, and no threat, no envelope, could make me turn back. I picked up Margaret's business card, tracing her handwritten words. They think I'll fold, I murmured. But they haven't seen anything yet. Monday was coming, and when it did, the truth would start to speak. Not through shouts, but through numbers, documents, and the resolve I'd honed over 29 years. Giardeau had underestimated me, and that would be their biggest mistake. Monday arrived with a rare clear sky over St. Paul, as if nature itself was rooting for me. I stood before the mirror, adjusting the navy suit I wore only for significant occasions, feeling like I was gearing up for battle. In my jacket pocket, Margaret's business card rested quietly, its handwritten note. Always do what's right. A guiding flame. Today I'd meet the Securities and Exchange Commission's investigative team at the Federal Building downtown, carrying over 1,200 pages of documents. Proof of systematic fraud at Giardeau Manufacturing. Stephen Caldwell and the board thought they'd silenced me. They were about to learn I was just getting started. I drove through familiar streets, past the cathedral where Margaret and I were married, past the Mississippi River shimmering in the sunlight. The Federal Building loomed ahead, a stark block of glass and steel, but I felt an odd certainty. For 29 years, as Director of Compliance, I'd kept Giardeau on the right side of the law, and now I'd use those same skills to expose them. I stepped into the lobby, where Robert Nguyen was waiting, his face serious but friendly. Michael, he said, shaking my hand. I'm sorry for what happened, but we're going to make this right. I nodded. Thanks, Robert. Let the numbers do the talking. We walked through a hallway, lined with frosted glass partitions, to a small conference room, where two SEC investigators awaited. Catherine Sullivan, a senior enforcement attorney, and Daniel Brooks, a forensic accountant. Both greeted me with professional courtesy. Mr. Harper, Catherine began, before we start, we need to confirm you understand the process. Once you share this information, a formal investigation will launch. There's no turning back. I met her gaze. I understand. I'm ready. For the next 3 hours, I walked them through my trove of documents, page by page. I started with financial irregularities from 2021, shipments that didn't match invoices, inflating paper profits by hundreds of thousands of dollars. I pointed out altered quality control certifications issued after products had shipped, a violation of federal regulations. And I laid out a pattern of revenue manipulation, which had accelerated since Stephen Caldwell's arrival 6 months ago. This isn't individual error, I said, sliding a stack of emails across the table. This is a system, directed from the top down. Daniel scrutinized the financial reports, his brow furrowing. These discrepancies aren't minor, he said, his voice low. GRW has overstated revenue by at least 18% over the past 2 years. That's securities fraud. Catherine nodded, jotting notes briskly. And you reported these issues internally, she asked. Multiple times I confirmed, handing over copies of 47 memos and 16 emails I'd sent to leadership, all ignored or dismissed. When Stephen came on, my concerns started going straight to his office, and they disappeared. Robert leaned forward. You believe your termination was directly tied to these reports? I nodded. No question. The timing 3 days before my pension vested is too precise. But more than that, I refused to sign off on Stephen's new cost-cutting initiative because it violated regulations. He needed me gone before I could report more. As the meeting wrapped up, Catherine outlined the next steps. We'll need your formal testimony. After that, the investigation will begin, typically kept confidential, until we decide on enforcement action. I asked, how long will it take? She gave a slight smile. It varies, but with the evidence you've provided, and the clear pattern of misconduct, we can move quickly. I left the conference room, feeling like I'd just set a timed explosive. Giardeau had no idea what was coming. I hadn't even made it home when my phone buzzed. It was Lisa Bennett, her voice frantic. Michael, something's happening. The board just called an emergency meeting. Stephen's been locked in his office all morning, and there's talk the SEC contacted our lawyers. I smiled, keeping my tone calm. I'm not surprised. Lisa hesitated. Michael, you did something, didn't you? I replied simply, I just did what I should have done a long time ago. She didn't press further, but I heard a note of respect in her silence. By afternoon, Giardeau was clearly in disarray. An old colleague, Tom from accounting, texted, the office is buzzing. Company stock dropped 8% this morning. Stephen got called to the boardroom. I didn't respond, but the news felt like a cool breeze. The SEC had moved faster than I'd expected, likely contacting Giardou's legal team right after my meeting. The board, which had always brushed off my reports, now faced reality. Truth couldn't be buried anymore. I pulled over by the Mississippi River, just a few miles from Giardou's office, and stepped out. The wind carried a crisp, watery scent, and I thought of Margaret. She'd always said, "Let the river sort your thoughts." I did, letting a quiet satisfaction fill me. I didn't need to confront Stephen or the board. My documents, meticulously organized over sleepless nights, had done that for me. They thought I was done, but I was only beginning. When I got home, Robert called. "Michael, it's moving faster than we thought," he said. "The SEC requested records from Giardou, and the board's in panic mode. Stephen's trying to pin the blame elsewhere, but no one's buying it." I nodded, though he couldn't see. "What'll they do next?" Robert replied. "They'll try to save themselves, but your evidence is too solid. This isn't just wrongful termination. It's high-level fraud, and they know it." I sat down, my eyes settling on Margaret's business card on the table. Her handwritten words gleamed under the lamplight, like a flame that couldn't be extinguished. "They thought I'd vanish," I murmured. "But the truth always wins." Giardou was crumbling, not because I shouted or threatened, but because I did what I'd always done. Documented the truth, reported it, and stood my ground. Stephen Caldwell had picked the wrong man to cross, and now he was paying, not with emotions, but with his own mistakes. I stood in the lobby of the federal courthouse in St. Paul, morning light streaming through the tall glass windows, catching the edges of Margaret's business card in my jacket pocket. Its handwritten note, "Always do what's right," felt like a whisper from her, reminding me that this path, however long and hard, was the right one. 3 weeks after my meeting with the SEC, everything had changed. Giardou Manufacturing, once an untouchable fortress, was now begging for mercy. Stephen Caldwell and 2 board members faced securities fraud charges, and I, Michael Harper, the man they thought would vanish, stood here watching justice unfold. It all moved quickly after the SEC meeting. Just days later, Giardou's legal team reached out through my attorney, Laura Peterson. Her voice over the phone was calm but sharp. "Michael, they want to settle. They know the SEC has your documents, and they're in a panic." I sat in my living room, gazing at Margaret's rose garden through the window, faint smile crossing my face. "What do they want?" Laura explained. "Giardou offered to retract my termination, reinstate my pension, and pay a substantial settlement, 5 years' salary, equivalent to $750,000, plus lifetime health insurance. They're terrified you'll sue for wrongful termination," she said, "and they know if the SEC moves forward, the whole company could collapse." I didn't answer right away. I thought of my 29 years as director of compliance, the late nights auditing numbers, the times I stood up to report wrongdoing only to be ignored. I thought of Margaret, of her promise that the truth would always prevail. "They have to admit they were wrong," I told Laura. "Not just the money. I want them to publicly acknowledge the firing was unjust." Laura hesitated, then agreed. "I'll push for that, but you know they won't like it." I chuckled softly. "They don't have to like it. They just have to do what's right." A week later, Giardou caved. In an internal memo sent to every employee, they declared my termination an administrative error and committed to restoring all benefits. A letter from Susan Mitchell, the newly appointed CEO tasked with cleaning up the mess, reached me through Laura. "Dear Mr. Harper, we sincerely apologize for the inconvenience caused. Giardou values your dedication and invites you to return as a senior consultant." I read the letter, then set it down beside Margaret's business card. A consultant, they still didn't get it. I didn't do this for the company, or for a job. I did it for integrity, the one thing they'd tried to strip away. I declined the consulting offer, but agreed to work with the SEC to improve whistleblower protection policies. Catherine Sullivan, the SEC attorney, called to thank me. "Michael, what you provided didn't just resolve the Giardou case. It's shaping how we handle future cases." She also informed me I was eligible for an SEC whistleblower award, a significant sum, enough to secure my financial future and James's family. I nodded over the phone. "Thank you, Catherine, but I didn't do it for the money." She laughed. "I know, that's why you're the right person for this." The trial against Stephen and the 2 board members took place at the federal courthouse, just a few miles from Giardou's office. I sat in the back row, watching Stephen walk in, his gray suit now hanging loosely on his frame. He avoided my gaze, but I didn't need an apology. As the judge read the charges, securities fraud, financial manipulation, and federal regulation violations, I felt a quiet satisfaction. Stephen had taken a plea deal for a reduced sentence, but his eyes, once cold and arrogant, now held only defeat. Before leaving the courtroom, I stood, catching his glance one last time. "You made your bed, Stephen," I murmured under my breath. The truth caught up. When I got home, I received a text from Lisa Bennett. "Michael, I don't know what you did, but the office is talking about you. They're calling you the guy who saved the company from Stephen." I didn't reply. I didn't need the praise. What I needed, justice, truth, and my promise to Margaret, had been fulfilled. I stepped onto the back porch, looking at her rose garden under St. Paul's sunset. A gentle breeze carried the damp earth smell, and I felt at peace. Not because of the victory, but because I'd stayed true to myself. I sat down, opened Margaret's business card, and traced her handwritten word. "This wasn't revenge," I whispered. "This was justice." Giardoe had given back what they owed me, not because they wanted to, but because they had no choice. Stephen and his accomplices faced consequences, not because I shouted or threatened, but because I did what I'd always done, stood up for the truth. They thought I'd disappear, but I proved that the truth never stays silent, and neither do I. I stood by the Mississippi River, a few miles from downtown St. Paul, where the afternoon sun painted golden streaks across the water. A cool breeze carried the scent of the river, and I felt a rare sense of peace. In my jacket pocket, Margaret's business card remained, its handwritten note, "Always do what's right," flame that never flickered. 3 months after I was fired, my journey had come to an end, not with anger or vengeance, but with justice. GRW Manufacturing had returned what they owed me. Stephen Caldwell faced the consequences, and I, Michael Harper, stood stronger than ever. Looking back, I realize it all began the moment I refused to sign that severance agreement. When Stephen thought he could buy my silence, he underestimated me. 29 years as director of compliance taught me that numbers don't lie, even when people do. But more than that, my father, with his calloused hands from the hardware store, taught me that honesty is the foundation of everything worth having. And Margaret, with her gentle smile, reminded me that integrity is something no one can take away. They were my guides, even when I stood alone against GRW's pressure. This journey wasn't easy. There were nights I wondered if I had the strength to keep going, when my phone buzzed with threats, when Stephen stood at my doorstep, when I looked into James's eyes and saw his worry. But every time I felt myself waver, I'd pull out Margaret's business card, read her words, and remember I wasn't fighting for myself alone. I was fighting for the promise I made to her, to James, to myself, and to anyone who's ever been told to stay quiet when they know the truth. Justice was served, not with shouts or fists, but with patience and truth. GRW reinstated my pension, paid me a $750,000 settlement, and publicly admitted their mistake. Stephen and his accomplices were prosecuted for securities fraud, and I turned down GRW's offer to return as a consultant, choosing instead to work with the SEC to protect other whistleblowers. The SEC's Whistleblower Award secured my financial future, but the real value wasn't in the money. It was in standing up, not for revenge, but for what was right. Now as I look to the future, I see a life that's simple but full. James and his wife are expecting their first child, and I'm planning a trip to Denver to meet my grandchild. I'll bring Margaret's business card to tell that child about the grandmother they'll never meet. A woman who taught me that truth is a fire that can light even the darkest corners. I'll also keep working with the SEC, not for recognition, but because I know there are others like me out there. People who need to be reminded that the truth is worth fighting for. Sitting in Margaret's rose garden, under a St. Paul's sunset, I think about what I want to say to you, the people who followed this story. Life isn't always fair. There are those who'll try to silence you, take what you've earned, and make you feel small. But I'm here to tell you, you're stronger than they think. The truth never stays silent, and if you stand up for it, you'll never be alone. My father used to say, "A good shopkeeper knows when to hold his ground." Margaret said, "Always do what's right." And I'm telling you, never give up. Let the truth guide you, and you'll find your way. My story isn't just about me, it's about all of us. Ordinary people, working hard, believing in justice. If you've ever been backed into a corner, told you're not strong enough, remember this story. Stand up, speak out, and let the truth do the talking. It changed my life, and it can change yours too. I want to thank you, from the bottom of my heart, for watching my story. Your support is what keeps stories like this alive. If my journey has inspired you, please hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss what's next. We need each other to keep the fire of truth burning bright. Thank you, and I hope to see you in the next video.